Hi, this is Alex Epstein. I'm at the Objectivist Conference 2019 in Cleveland, Ohio. Objectivist philosophy has been something that's just changed my life and my thinking and really helped me shape the thinking that was the basis of the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And one thing I was excited about coming to this conference is the opportunity to talk to some of my favorite objectivist philosophers. So I thought I asked them if they'd record a little interview where I'd ask them about how objectivist philosophy applies to some of the top cultural issues today that I'm not focused on myself, but that I'm really interested in hearing the objectivist perspective on. So I want to welcome Onkar Ghate. Hey, Onkar.
Hey, Alex.
So Onkar was really my intellectual mentor at the Ayn Rand Institute, as you'll see, I think super smart guy. And then Greg Salmieri. Hey, hi. Greg, another philosopher who's helped me tremendously. So what we're doing today is a segment that I'm calling Thinking Points. And the idea is that in the news, you get talking points, and you hear maybe the right say one set of talking points and the left say another, and it's pretty predictable. And I often think I'd really like to know what some of the best objectivist thinkers who are following these issues have to say about them. So that's what we're going to start out with. So the first issue I want to talk with you guys about is what's happening with the abortion issue, which is a perennial issue in American politics, particularly since Roe v. Wade in 1973, but has really heated up. And in particular, there's been this set of abortion bans that seem to be unprecedented in certain ways. So for example, Utah has passed a law in which abortions are banned after 18 weeks. And in Missouri, it's 8 weeks. In Mississippi and Georgia, it's 6 weeks. And that's before many women know that they're pregnant. And I believe in Alabama, it's any time after the egg is fertilized. And part of what's going on, so one of the controversies is just, are these policies right? But then there's a movement behind these policies explicitly to get Roe v. Wade overturned, or at least reconsidered and overturned. And there's been a little bit of backlash. So for example, the district court in Mississippi struck down their law, and particularly from the entertainment and the corporate spaces, we're seeing some opposition, like the head of Twitter signed a letter opposing these bans, and Netflix has said it might stop doing projects in Georgia. But overwhelmingly, it seems like the anti-legal abortion side is definitely has the high ground. It definitely has the momentum. So I'm interested in what you guys think, but I just want to give my own summary of what I see the typical talking points in the debate as. And I looked up on the website allsides.com, and they gave a pretty good summary of the reasons that we hear on both sides. So in terms of, I'm just going to call it abortion should be legal, abortion should be illegal, to not talk about pro-choice, pro-life, which I think can be ambiguous. So in terms of abortion is illegal, the three main arguments I read here are abortion is murder, that's one. Two is life begins at conception, so unborn babies are human beings with the right to life. And then three is fetuses feel pain during the abortion procedure. And then in terms of for legal abortion, one is that the U.S. Supreme Court has declared abortion to be a fundamental right guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. Two, that reproductive choice empowers women by giving them control over their own bodies. And then three is that personhood begins after a fetus becomes viable, able to survive outside the womb, or after birth, not at conception. So I've thrown a lot at you. I'll start with Onkar. How do you think about this debate, and how do you think others should be thinking about this debate?
I think there's at least two major forces at work that one has to really think through and think clearly about. So one is this idea that abortion is murder. And the 2 points you read, I think, are basically the same thing. Life begins at conception. And you can say, well, then the fetus has a right to life. But if it begins at conception and you end an innocent life, then it's murder, if you view it as human. So it's essentially the same point. And I view that as essentially a religious viewpoint. So it's an attempt to inject religion into the formation of law. And one has to really think about what that means, and that if you take seriously the US system that was trying to separate church and state or religion from law, that there's something deeply problematic about that. And we can explore what it means.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, but you said there was a second
and the
thread
second
as well?
is to think about rights and what rights actually mean. What they mean at the core of the US system, at the Declaration of Independence, is setting out the basic purpose of government and law. It's to protect these rights. There's this rights have a definite meaning. It's not just, this is what I would like to enact in law. So if there's a right to abortion, or there's a right to health care, or there's a right to free college education, all that really means in the end is, I think that there ought to be a law that does this. But that's not what rights really mean in the American system. So there's a definite conception of what rights are, which I think is being violated in the understanding. If you think there's a right, a fetus has rights, you just don't understand the concept of rights that the American system should be governed by.
Great. So I want to go into both of those, but before we go into those, Greg, is there anything you want to say at the outset?
Yeah, I'd like to add one thing. If you looked at the pro-abortion or pro-having it be legal argument, the ones you read and the others you hear most, like if we make it illegal, there'll be back alley abortions and women will die. One important thing's left out of all of this, and I think this is why the defenders of abortion have been on the run since Roe v. Wade, have been losing in the public opinion. If support for it is ebbing away, the right, religious right that's been anti-abortion has been more powerful, which is that abortion is good. Often it's morally good. Often it's a heroic act. I admire women who've had abortions. There are a couple of cases, maybe one or two happened where someone shouldn't have had one but did. But almost all the time where people have them, it's because there's either a medical problem or a personal issue where they're not ready to take on the awesome responsibility of parenthood. As someone whose wife is pregnant now, I'm very much thinking about how big a responsibility that is. And it's not something to take on lightly. And if you have doubts, you're not sure if you should do it, then you shouldn't. It's not, the default should be not to become a parent, not to become one because you happen to get knocked up or get someone knocked up. And someone who realizes that their life is important, that making decisions about, consciously planning your reproduction and whether you're going to have a kid or not, and then bucks a lot of social opposition to do it. And a lot of people are going to say it's bad, there's a shame associated with it, and does that because she recognizes that that's what's good for her and what's good for any future children she has or present children. A lot of abortions are of people who already have kids and don't want more. That is heroic. That is a profoundly moral choice, and the women who do it don't get credit for it, and they ought to.
Great. So we have those as starting points. I think definitely what you're saying in part depends on part of what Onkar's saying, because, and I want to start with this issue of the fetus or the embryo being a human life, because there is an argument which is basically, okay, life begins at conception. Like if the woman allowed this to happen, if she didn't interfere with it, then this would be a baby. So isn't this a life? And you're saying that this is religious, but many people who hold this view, they do tend to be religious, which is an interesting thing. But they'll often say, no, this is a scientific view. Like, can you deny that life begins at conception? Of course you can't deny it, and so you're opposing a human life. So how would you respond to that?
You have to distinguish. So if you're talking about the state of an embryo, so that's basically the first 8 weeks of pregnancy, you're dealing with, yes, you can view it as this is something alive, though it's dependent on the mother for its whole sustenance, but it is only potentially human. It's a human embryo. It's not an individual human being. So it's a potential. To say it's a human embryo is that if it develops and was carried to term, it becomes a human being. It's not a cat embryo or a dog embryo, but it's not an individual human being yet. It's the potential to develop into that. And that's exactly the choice to be a parent is, am I going to do this and take this to term? And that you have to have the control over that and a choice over that. So if it's an equation of the potential with the actual, and to say, well, this is murder, is to say you're ending the life of a fully formed individual human being. If I murder you, that's what I'm doing. That is nothing like ending a pregnancy at the stage of an embryo. And to equate those two is just, you don't understand the difference between a potential and an actual. And you could say, well, a sperm is living. And why isn't masturbation murder? You're ending a human sperm.
Yeah, I remember I heard once the argument that someone was saying, well, what about embryos in a lab? Like, what's the status of those? Like, do those have rights? And then if they do have rights, then what does that mean? Should women be forced to carry them to term? So you do regard this as a religious perspective, not a secular scientific perspective?
Yeah, to view it as what we have as an individual human being, that it is immoral to end this thing, that is, I think, is essentially a religious view. It's that God injects a soul into the embryo when the sperm and egg, when the egg's fertilized by the sperm. That that's the viewpoint. And if you have that viewpoint, then you're going against God's will if you end this thing. And you can see this in the religious, the religious framework of America. For a long time, the Protestants were not against abortion. And the Catholics made a big issue of this. And then it's gradually adopted by the Protestants that, maybe this should be part of our dogma. But it's dogma. It's a religious viewpoint that says, this thing is declared by God as sacred, so it's untouchable.
The whole question of when does life begin, as applied to human reproduction, is essentially a religious question, because there's not something alive when the conception happens where there wasn't before. The sperm and the egg were both alive. What you're getting is there's life all through the process, and what you're getting is a gradual process of genetic recombination and then gradual individuation and growing of the new, progressively distinct from the parent's being. There's not a point, the idea that there's a point where there's no life and then there's life, that's a mystical view. There's life the whole time, and it's developing into a new human being from being first two different parts of two human beings, then something that's genetically distinct but not even an animal yet, it's just a cell, then a cluster of cells, and then gradually more and more like a human being until it is ready to be born. And then after birth, of course, it develops further.
I guess one thing that strikes me, particularly in the case of the situation where it's an embryo, I want to talk about later stages, is that, I'm a man, and I've tried, the more I try to think about what does this concretely mean for many different women, what would it be like to be forced to carry an embryo to term, I think that is a huge imposition on somebody. And it strikes me that even if people have religious views where they think this has a right, or they have concern, or certainly there's more understandable concern, I think, at later stages, it still strikes me that there doesn't seem to be much compassion for the situation that women would go through and what that means. What do you think is going on there?
I think that's part of the evidence that it's religious. So it's if you really view this is a commandment from God, that this thing now is to be regarded as sacred, has to be carried to term, then it doesn't matter what the individual woman thinks about this, what she would choose to do, what she experiences, and even if there's a lot of hardship and pain to carry this to term, that's your duty to do this. And the fact that you were reading from the laws that now they don't even care about rape. So if it's completely an involuntary pregnancy, it's that, they might think, well, that's unfortunate that it happened to you, but now you have this duty that there's this thing sacred inside of you, and it has to be brought to term. And your individual life decisions, values don't matter, but that's the kind of religious viewpoint. God counts, you don't, except as you're to carry out his plan. And unfortunately, his plan was you're going to get raped, and you have to carry this to term. And I think that's very revealing of a religious mentality.
And I want to talk about this to shift or to relate this to the issue of rights, because there's part of this question is what do we have rights to? And it's interesting that the woman doesn't have a right to do this, and that seems to directly oppose her right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so what do you think is the right way to think of rights here? Because rights are one of the central concepts that are being discussed, but it doesn't seem like either side has a really coherent view of rights. Yeah, so
I think there's at least two essential things. That rights they're for an individual, they're to enable an individual human being, so an actual individual human being, to pursue their own life. And it's a right to take the kinds of actions that you need to be able to take to pursue your own life. So the right in the Declaration, rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. The right to life means the right to take all those actions that I, as an independent human being, need to be able to take to pursue my life. And it means I need to be able to think, I need to be able to speak, I need to be able to earn property. And liberty is what protects these kinds of actions. And it's all for the purpose of pursuing my own happiness. And so they're rights to actions. They're not rights to any kind of outcome. That's one of the things. And they're individual. They're about the individual realizing their life and pursuing their happiness. And it's each independent individual is to have the same rights. So there's the whole concept of rights is there's no conflict between each individual has the right to engage in these actions. They might not be successful in it. They might end up unhappy. They might not earn very much property, but they have the right to take the kinds of actions, and every individual does have that. The moment you start talking about there's conflicts between the rights of this and the rights of that, you haven't understood or properly defined rights. So this is part of the issue. They're about independent action. The fetus or the embryo is not an independent entity. It's not an independent organ. It's dependent on the mother. And so to say that it has rights, you have to deny the rights of the mother because they're inherently, for her to be able to act, if this is viewed as an independent thing, it's not. But then if it has independent claims and so on, that limits her ability to act.
Well, just to concretize that, part of the context for the idea of rights, and part of what it means that they're two independent beings, or the beings that have rights are independent of one another, is that each of them could act with respect to the other or not. So you can ask me a question, I can answer it, or you could not, and we could work together or not. We could each go our separate ways. And then there's a question, given that these two beings can interact or not interact, how are we going to govern their interactions? What's up to whom? When should they and shouldn't they interact? But if you think about a fetus in the woman, there's nothing the woman can do that doesn't affect the fetus. And nothing the fetus can do, it doesn't do the things it does consciously, but it squirms about and so forth, that doesn't affect the woman. It's a constant, there's no ability not to act together while they're in that situation. And that's what shows you that the context for this concept of rights just isn't applicable yet. It only starts to come up when you have two things and the question of how are they going to interact. When one's in the other and constantly acting on the other, and whether what she eats affects it and so forth constantly, that context just isn't there. And the other point about rights that's important here is rights don't exhaust morality. There are all kinds of things I could insult you, whatever, that would be wrong to do to you, that aren't a violation of your rights. And there might be some things the woman can do with respect to the fetus that would be wrong, but that doesn't mean they're violations of rights. And there might be some cases in which an abortion would be wrong. But it's not the same thing as violating the fetus's rights. That presupposes two beings interacting.
So how do you, I think one counter argument you get is how do you draw the line with children? Like, and they'll say, a 1-year-old, can you kill a 1-year-old? The 1-year-old isn't independent, right?
Well, that's why I think this sense of independence, they can interact or not, it really helps concretize that. Because even the moment the baby's out of the womb, the moment it's born, it's not constantly in every respect acting on the mother and she on him anymore, right? Now, it's true, it can't live on its own. It needs someone to take care of it. But anybody else could come in and fill in the gap. If the mother wants to give it up for adoption, she could. If she abandons it, which would be wrong, nevertheless, somebody else could come and take it. And I think abandoning it should be illegal, but nonetheless, someone could come in and take it. So they're not joined closer than at the hip, joined in the body. When they're joined in that way, there's no such thing as the mother acting or anyone acting on the mother that doesn't impact the fetus, or acting on the fetus that doesn't impact the mother. There's a really significant kind of independent separateness that happens at birth. And that has to be distinguished from the sense in which it's true. The baby does depend on its parents or on some caregiver.
What do you guys think about what people on your side of the debate should be doing? Because I mentioned that it seems like the anti-legal abortion side definitely has the moral high ground right now. And I was looking at, for instance, this thing that Jack Dorsey did on Twitter, and it was just something like, it was focused on equality. We're for equality for women, but one side is making this a moral issue of life and death and has an unusual amount of confidence. Conservatives don't always have moral confidence on, say, economic issues, but on this issue, there's a huge amount of moral confidence, and the other side seems to be very weak. So what would you suggest?
Well, the left does think of it, equality in some cases is a moral issue, and the left does think of it as one. So they're trying to make it a moral issue, but they're not, I think, getting to the important moral issues. So one is rights, but the other is, I think, just appreciating that this is a good and admirable thing that women do sometimes. Celebrating cases of people who were thinking about their lives. Because of that, they decided to have this procedure, how it helped their lives. Getting rid of the taboo associated with abortion, I think, is important. And there are some people doing that who write stories about why they had an abortion, but I don't think there's enough of it, and it's too much. Well, of course, abortion is distasteful and bad, but we should allow it because of equality or because of back alley abortion. It is often good, and it should be celebrated as something someone really stood up for and did. And
if you think of what the sort of the highest classification of that kind of moral argument is, and then what I think is the distinctively religious crowd pushing, to say that it's a responsible choice, it's a moral choice, it's a selfish choice. So it is, I'm taking my life seriously. This is not something that I want now. I'm going to enter and become a parent only if it's a real value to me. I'm bringing a child into existence. But the whole point of doing it is we want a family. It's a value to us. And this is not the time, so we're not doing it. That's a really, really selfish action. From our perspective, that is what makes it moral. But think of the left trying to defend this. They rail against selfishness everywhere. The profit motive in capitalism, that is corrupt. The pursuit of happiness, no, it's supposed to be your concern with the common good and the public good and other people, and you're supposed to sacrifice to this. And now all of a sudden they're going to say in abortion, no, in abortion you don't have to sacrifice. That's a very difficult argument for them to make. And then if you think of the religious side, their whole thing is, yeah, you're going to sacrifice. There's this individual who it's only a potential. You're going to sacrifice your life and give it up for the sake of this, and this is another thing, and this is the other, so that's what's sacred. And so it's presented as it's inherently selfless in this. You're the ward of this thing, sacred thing. So that's an easy argument to make and push in a culture that's saturated with it's evil to be selfish, it's great to be selfless. And that's part of, I think, what the sort of the wider philosophical context for what makes this issue hard to argue. It's
not an accident then that the left is the one that's morally self-confident when we're talking about economic regulation, higher tax rates, getting rid of inequality, and the right, the anti-abortion religious right, is the ones that are morally self-confident when they're talking about abortion. It's whoever is calling for sacrifice is the one who's self-confident, and whoever is trying to defend life and happiness on earth is the one that's timid, because we're in a culture that doesn't value individual human life, at least not as moral. Individual people value their lives. They don't recognize that that's good. And in fact, they think it's bad.
I often try to think about how do I frame discussions in a way that will encourage rational thought. And it occurs to me that one thing that if I were having a conversation about somebody with this, I might say, like, can we agree that in outlawing abortion, you are demanding a massive personal sacrifice from women? Like, at least acknowledge that. I mean, you might say, I believe this thing has rights and that supersedes it, but say that you're telling women that the whole course of their, and the men that they're associated with, like the whole course of your life is going to change, and whatever you had planned, because you had sex, even if you got raped, like your whole life has to be devoted to supporting this embryo to make it become a life, and then you have responsibility. What do you think of that as just a way of framing the discussion?
I think it's good, and I think it will pick up on the extent to which people do think it's important for people to live their own lives and flourish and have values. But I think a lot of people don't all the way down hold that as a value, and they'll think, when I had kids, it was the best thing. I didn't want them, but then I found, when you hold your child for the first time, it totally changes your outlook, and I'm much happier now than I would have been when I was living all selfishly and just getting drunk every night. Right? People will say that kind of thing if they're the kind of person who wasn't taking their life seriously, didn't have a view of what they wanted to make of their lives, that then they're being asked to sacrifice for the pregnancy. So the more someone is a self-starter, the more someone is ambitious, the more someone has something they want to make of their lives and expects other people to be like that too and values that in other people, the more that's going to really be persuasive to them. And the more there's someone who thinks, c'est la vie, who has any control really in the end anyway? Life is just something that happens to us, and you can't really make yourself happy. You don't know what's going to be best for you. You're hubristic and you're too hung up on yourself if you think you can do that. Life's something that just happens to you. The more someone's like that, that argument's just not going to engage with them.
And I just remember when I was 18, because I believed I believed that abortion should be illegal when I was, 17 or 18. And I just look back and I think one thing that I lacked is I just had no concrete sense. I was 18, I just no concrete sense of what it meant to have a life and what that, and I had no expectation of becoming a woman. I had no idea of what expectation.
Probably no conception of being a parent and the responsibility involved in being a parent.
Yeah. And even not even just realizing the risks, I mean, just like actually, having a pregnancy, even carrying a baby to term is much more risky for a woman's health than having an abortion, period, let alone if there are or medical complications. So yeah, I would just like to see, I think there are ways of framing it so that people can actually have compassion for the living, and then that, I think, alleged compassion for the potential can be put in that context. Anything either of you want to add or that you think is an important aspect of this issue?
Just since we have interest in objectives and interest in Ayn Rand as a common context, just something about her view on this. She was really, really adamantly pro-abortion. She thought that the attempts to deny abortion rights by the Republicans of her time were shameful. She compared the religious right to the Ayatollah Khomeini. I mean, this was a serious, serious issue for her. I mean, at the top of her political priorities in the early 80s, she literally said she morally condemned anyone who would vote for Reagan. She thought the anti-abortion stance was motivated by pure malice towards life on Earth. I think as a psychological matter and a read on what's driving people now, I don't go as far as her in that. I think there is a lot more confusion about this issue now and a lot more honest error possible than she thought. But this was, we are soft-spoken compromisers on this issue compared to Ayn Rand, who was a real firebrand about this issue in particular.
And I think one way of thinking of how she thought about it that relates to because she really emphasized that you're dealing with a potential human being, not an actual human being. When someone asks you to sacrifice and give up 2 years of your life to become part of the Peace Corps, to give up a year of your salary that we're going to send to Africa, it's going at least to actual human beings. So you're sacrificing for the sake of other actual human beings. The idea that you're going to throw away your life, and a woman's going to throw away all their plans for the sake of a potential. So you're not even sacrificing for an actual human being, but for a potential. That, I think she thought it's below normal altruism, and she had a very negative view of normal altruism. And I think that's part of what is animating her stridency on this issue.
Just one more personal thought, to viewers. We were talking about this as a political issue, right? What should the law be? But this is a personal issue. If you are alive and you're having sex or thinking of having sex, or you're a woman and even if you don't choose to have sex, you can get raped, right? This is something that can come up in your life. And I think part of being responsible about your own sexuality is not making this decision only once you're pregnant or once your girlfriend is pregnant, right? You should be thinking about, and it's definitely for me, part of my thinking about having sex for the first time is, well, what would we do if she got pregnant? Do we have the same view about this? Do I trust her character that she would do the kind of thing I think she should do about it? And do we agree about it? And I think if you're not having those kind of thoughts, then you're not being responsible about your sex life. You're not being thoughtful. You're not an important part of your life. You're just leaving up to chance. And once you do start thinking of it personally in that way, I think that makes clear what's at stake politically.
And one last point on that. I mean, on her context, which I think is relevant, and our context is different. The pill is relatively new when she is writing. And if you think of it, of what the forms of contraception were available and what's available to a woman, that you can abort if you become pregnant and you didn't want to become pregnant. That was really, really important to have that right. In an era when everyone's familiar with being on the pill, and the consequences of that it really is an effective form of contraception. So that is a very different context from when you could think in the early 70s, if you were denied the right to have an abortion, that is it's still a big issue, but it was a much bigger issue, I think, then.
One other thing I remember, because I researched the issue of bioethical issues in depth many years ago, and I remember reading when in vitro fertilization was pioneered, there was a large religious opposition to that. And the idea is, well, you're creating these embryos and you're not using all of them, and you're not implanting all of them, and isn't that the destruction of a life? And it's interesting that seems to have been dropped fairly opportunistically, because the logic of it still holds up in terms of, this is an embryo with rights, but there isn't that same push. Is that your impression?
It's true that we don't have the kind of religious opposition to in vitro to the extent that we used to, but we do have it connected to other things that come up a lot when you're doing in vitro and testing. So another kind of ban that you didn't mention when you're talking about the bans that just happened recently is bans on selective abortions. So abortions for fetuses that are found to have Down syndrome or some other defect. There are a lot of people who think that you are morally required to bring these babies to term. I'll say for my part, I think it's immoral to carry such a child to term knowingly, and I think it's immoral not to test. I think this is part of taking your life and what you want to bring into the world seriously. So whenever you have these kind of scientific advancements about reproduction, there's this kind of controversy taking place.
So, I mean, why do you think, and that might be of all the things that we've said today, that might be the most controversial in people's eyes. So why do you say that? And you seem to say it with a lot of confidence, like you think it's a moral obligation.
Yeah.
How come?
I don't think it should be a legal obligation, I should say, but I think if you have respect for what human life is and why you want to create a human life, why you want to have a child, and you're really thinking about that, I think you're thinking about the human potential without setbacks and handicaps. And of course, there are plenty of people who are born with setbacks or handicaps who overcome them and who go on to lead great lives. But it's tragic that they had to overcome them. And when you have an individual person who's real and has a handicap, then of course you can't hold it. You shouldn't. It would be monstrously unjust to hold it against the person, and you could admire what they do to overcome it, and you should try to help them to overcome it. But when there's not a person there yet, when there's not an individual human being there yet, and you're thinking about what kind of human being do we want to create, what can we do to create a kind of life that is going to be the best for the person living it, then the idea that to create a life that's going to have exceptional handicaps and difficulties that in many cases isn't going to be able to grow up to live any kind of independent human life, I think is monstrous. And I think when someone says that that's what they want to do, that shows me that they don't know what human life is about and they don't love human life.
That's powerful. Thanks to both of you for providing us some clarity, and thanks for taking an hour at OCON, and it was good to see you guys again.
You too.
Yeah, thanks, Alex.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to never miss a video.